We are back with Roy Macintyre, former F3 pilot, and we're here to talk about Maple Flag. So, Roy, can you tell us what this exercise is all about and how you became part of it?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me back onto Aircrew Interview. It's always a pleasure to come and talk to your audience. Um, Today, Maple Flag, uh, by the name implies, it's in Canada, and to a certain extent, it's the same as the red flag exercises. But I must say, right at the start, not as big. It's hosted by the Royal Canadian Air Force and usually, I believe, still at Cold Lake Air Base, which is away out in Alberta. The landscape very flat, plains, agricultural land, and of course there are lakes. So very different from the terrain that you get involved in if you're in Red Flag at Nellis, because there's a lot of hills, terrain, and stuff. So very different in terms of the geography. As I've said already, it's size-wise, it tends to be smaller. Red Flag carries the kudos of the big event, and that attracts the bigger participants, both in number and size, physical size of the aircraft. But my experience of Maple Flag was still very, very valuable. Obviously, we're invited to go, so we know we're going months ahead, and we get ourselves as best prepared as we can by practicing some exercises, usually four ships against domestic opponents or whatever, over the coming months, and we decide who's going and who's, more importantly, who's going to be leading the four-ship formations and potentially the larger formations, i.e. the mission leads. And that's very similar to what we would do if we're going to Red Flag as well. It's an opportunity to upgrade some aircrew as well, get them up to four-ship leads, eight-ship leads, etc., etc. So it's a very, very useful exercise for the squadron as a whole, as well as a great experience of multi-element large force exercises. Now, I'm speaking about my experience, which is back in 2004, so it is very dated, but I'm hoping that today's squadrons get something similar out of it as well. So we knew we were going to Red Flag in May of 2004, so we had our domestic workup within the squadron. Squadron was treble one at that time. Did I just say treble one? Yes, I did. Um, Treble one at the time. So, and we worked out who was going to be the candidates to get the maximum benefit. Now, the other thing that was going on with the F3 force, treble one squadron, no different at that time, was we were pretty much still in early days with the AMRAAM, which of course was a big step forward for us from the semi-active Skyflash missile. However, we were still at what we called the austere level, which was the initial installation on the F3. It had no mid-course guidance. Now, without going into a long technical explanation, I'm sure a lot of your audience know anyway, the AMRAAM relies, to be most effective, on being fed updated target information during its time of flight, and then at a certain range, it will go, yep, I'm happy, and switch on its own radar and go autonomous, and then home in. What that means is we can fire at longer ranges and update the missile, and it will correct for target maneuver. Now, in 2004, we didn't have that. I don't believe it was coming. So we were working in the austere mode, which means we basically were fire and forget. We gave the target information, full information pre-launch, but once the AMRAAM went, that was it. It was left to its own devices. Shorter ranges, the higher probability of kill was higher because the amount of target maneuver wouldn't be so drastic. Firing at long ranges, though, it was basically going off blind and hoping when it got to the point that it was going to open its own radar up, that the target was still in sight and it was the correct target. So we had to be very careful about how we used this weapon because basically it was a wild dog off the leash once we let it go. So that was the big aspect that we were, from a training side, were looking at. To get there, also, it was May, so it's not too cold going across the Atlantic. Can't remember exactly why we didn't take what was up until then the usual route, which is across just south of Iceland, south of Greenland to Goose Bay in Labrador. That was not the route. We were going to take a more extended southerly route. Yeah, it was with air-to-air refuelling, but the first day was out of Leuchars, meet up with the tankers out of Bryce Norton. I think it was about 3 waves. It was a TriStar and 2 VC10s, and they took us to Leuchars, which is in the Azores. First time I'd been there, happy being there. Tech wasn't really desperate to go back. It was nice enough, but it's not your top level holiday spot. Anyway, overnight stay there. They had a Nimrod sweeping for us just in case there was trouble and somebody had to eject. It meant there was support fairly close and quickly. And then following on behind the inevitable Sweeper Hercules, which carried some of the ground crew and were there to drop in to any diversions that may have happened. From Leuchars, then, we push across the rest of the Atlantic the next day, and we went to Bangor in Maine. It was a civil airport, yeah. Again, stop over there. That's when the first minor hitches started, I recall, because 2 of the Tornadoes went US at that point, and in fact they were almost 4 or 5 days late getting to Cold Lake. The problem with that is, of course, the tankers move on and it leaves the 2 Tornadoes unsupported unless you sacrifice a tanker or a tanker can turn back and collect them. So it does cause logistical problems. But anyway, for the rest of us, moving on, we flew on the next day, so we're into day 3. We flew across the bulk of Canada. And I do remember flying right over the top of Montreal and then looking down, I just rolled the wing over and realised we're right over the Grand Prix circuit.
Really?
With the Canadian Grand Prix. Not at the time, but I did recognise the island and I could make out the track. So that was quite interesting. Anyway, we get to Cold Lake, and there's normally a day or two to get reorganised from the trail over. There's the usual in-briefings, as we call them, the BNOs. There will be no this, that, and the next thing. But basically the general safety briefs, etc., and the air traffic briefs of how you get in and out of Cold Lake, the air traffic procedures, the operating areas, etc. So it wasn't quite straight into it. What was a little bit of a shock, particularly when you're talking about the Royal Air Force, and it is a standing joke, but there's an element of truth to it, is the accommodation. When we got there, basically they were very new, but they were porta cabins. And when we had a look at our accommodation, they were pretty small rooms with 2 bunks in it. You know, I'm not going to say prison cell, but they were basic for it. And then one of the blocks was the toilet ablution block, etc., etc. Weather overnight and early in the morning could be quite cold. They were warm enough. The accommodation was warm enough, but then by the early afternoon it could get quite warm. So there was a fair variation in the temperatures, and it was more a problem for the ground crew who started early morning preparing the aircraft wrapped up like polar bears, and in the afternoon, shorts and t-shirts, etc. So that was quite interesting. But generally, the weather was pretty good. Canadian people in the Canadian Air Force, very welcoming, great hosts, etc., etc. And as usual, the food halls, etc., etc., are on a more permanent basis, and they were very good. So domestically, Air Force usual grumblings that it wasn't a 5-star hotel, but food and drink, we were fine. Who else was there? Well, obviously the Canadians had people there. The aggressors from Nellis, the Red Flag Aggressor Squadron, F-16s, they were up and they were going to provide the Red Force. I recall the Germans were across with their Phantom F4Fs, which was quite interesting, and there was some American Air Force F-15s down from Alaska. So I'm not quite sure. It's obviously for them not as long a journey to get down to Cold Lake as it would have been to continue on further south to Nellis for a Red Flag. So There was a fair spread. I can't quite recall whether we had an E3 or not. We obviously had our tankers, or some of them, for a while, but
I think the
I'm
Mirages were there, weren't they? The Mirage F1s, were they there?
it could well have been. This is where I'm going to struggle a little bit because, as I say, it's 20 odd years ago, and my recall of exactly who was there. I think there was some Harriers there. There was certainly some ground attack element to make it multifaceted. It wasn't just air to air. So it was a fair number, not as high as I said right at the start, as high the number of participants as there usually is for a red flag. But there was a fair spread. They have a system it was very similar to red flag in terms of the range recording, because all the aircraft would carry pods and cards, and they would debrief down to a central display which we'd use on the main debriefs. So that was good. I cannot recall whether we had a JTIDS network available to us in that area or not. So there's two question marks. Data link JTIDS for the F3 and an E3. I don't recall that. So that's two fairly significant pieces of jigsaw that we didn't have in our usual armoury. But hey, you practice with what you've got, and in reality, you may end up in a degraded situation where you don't have all the bits that you want. But we did use the AMRAAM in its austere mode, and we did have a computer simulation model, which is one of the weapons instructors I was using all the time to work out the validity of shots. Because, of course, the other thing, AMRAAM, and we had ASRAAM at that time as well, we would not put those parameters onto the open range network to let all the participants see, because it was still very much restricted. Well, not restricted, it was secret. So in terms of weapon parameters, it was we kept that to ourselves, and shot validity, we would declare whether it was a valid shot or not. And unless you knew the AMRAAM, so the other American participants, like the F-15s, etc., everyone else would have to take it on trust, and you'd hope they would. But it prolonged things a little bit in terms of the weapon validity than it would have done normally. The mission itself followed very similar routine and lines to a red flag mission, in as much as you would know at the start of the day whether you were going to be your formation leader, whether you were going to be the mission leader. And from now on, I'm just going to talk about blue air, because red air, as I say, was taken care of by the aggressors from Nellis and their F-16s. So the day would start with a mass brief for everybody, including red air. There'd be a MET brief, and that would be a fairly important thing because it would decide whether anything is going to happen or not. Yeah. And the overall exercise director for that day would make the go, no go decision if there was any question mark excuse me, on the weather. We would get a refresh on the rules and regulations from the safety side, all the usual bits and pieces, and perhaps a little bit of education in terms of somebody giving a short 2-3 minute lecture on a weapon system of theirs, an airframe, something like that, just so that all participants learnt something about the other players. But it wouldn't be too in-depth, because after that we would split, and Blue Air mission leader would declare when the Blue Air mass brief would happen. And it wouldn't be too far on. It would maybe about, I'm trying to remember, 15, 20 minutes, maybe half an hour later. Red Air would disappear and they would do their own thing. They would be being fed by the exercise director the necessary information so they could be ready to service our needs. And I'll come back to Red Air again. I know I've talked about it in the past, but it is a hobby horse of mine. So we would all just sit, try and relax. The blue mission leader would now be getting his tasking. In reality, on ops, on real ops, this would have happened the day before. But we can't afford to stretch out the exercise to get, otherwise we'd be here too long to get the number of missions in that they would wanted to do. So it was all kind of compressed into one day. When he was ready, the the mission leader, the blue mission leader, would lead in the mass brief, and that would be all the mission the blue mission players, to get a big picture. This is what the mission aim is. This is generally how we're going to do it. And he's talking big blocks. It's almost like general with his army on a map. We're going to do this, and we're going to get round it. We're going to send in these players first. Then he'd be prior to the mission brief, he would already have talked to the individual formation leaders and have given them and taken ideas from them on how things are going on. And particularly if it was a blue air defence leader like myself, I would need information. In fact, I'd be taking advice and following advice from the lead strikers, because I don't know how they would attack a target. So they tell me what they need to do, and then I would arrange the other players around that to make it happen. So it was very much a building block approach and taking in information, taking advice to make the big picture work. And all the formation leaders would have a general idea before you go into the mass brief about what's going on. And certainly any showstoppers, that isn't going to work, hopefully ironed out before you present the plan. And somebody at the back goes, excuse me, what about that formation isn't good? Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Not what you want to happen at that stage.
No.
So the mass brief happens, again, all overseen by the exercise directors to make sure it's all safe and legal and complying. No questions. Right, you now split to your individual formation briefs, where you get down to the nitty-gritty of call signs, frequencies, etc., taxi times, your order of takeoff, etc., where you're going to be capping, all the little nitty-gritty that really has got no place in the mass brief because it's far too detailed and far too particular to one little section of all the people there. They don't need to hear it. They can, it's wasting their time. So you keep it broad brush and important in the mass brief, and then the nitty-gritty, including the detailed tactics, which should be, excuse me, for the likes of the F3, SOP, standard operating procedure. Try and use that as much as possible. It's not really the place to start inventing all your new, I've got a brilliant trick, we'll try this out, etc. We keep it as standard operating procedures as possible, because that also compresses it in terms of the time for the individual formation briefs, because you never have enough time. It always seems, it doesn't matter, you're starting at 5:30 fast asleep in the morning, and you're still going, you realise we have to walk in 5 minutes. Come on, let's go to get our kit on. Always seem to have time pressure, and that individual formation, individual people discipline to get organised. But it's also a factor of thing. This is not a laid back in a deck chair, let's think about it and go in an hour or two. You really do have to get on with it. So efficiency is quite important. We didn't carry a lot of combat kit personally in this, and I don't recall carrying a personal weapon, because there might, if you did jump out, you would meet something. That happened in Alaska. We were issued with personal weapons because the bear threat, if you ended up ejecting, was real. Alberta farmlands, no. So it was fairly straightforward in that respect. Out to the jets, crank them up. Yes, we were using the frequency agile radios, the half-quicks. As I say, can't remember whether we were getting into a data link network, etc. But it was the usual half hour or so walk to get the aircraft cranked up and out. Taxiing at our allotted time, that then became an air traffic problem. If somebody was held up, do they hold up the whole stream, or do they get the flow going? They generally went with getting the flow going. Again, numbers not as high as they are in Nellis, but you're still talking about a reasonable number. It's in excess of 30 aircraft getting airborne. So they can't afford to hold up the stream too long if somebody's got a problem. Transiting, this is where I'll have to admit my memory is a little bit light. it didn't strike me as being too long. The operating areas were quite close to Cold Lake. Unlike in Nellis, where there's a little bit of a transit to get round Las Vegas or up the east side to get into the operating areas north of the areas in Nellis where we're not allowed to operate, tended to be in the northern end. So that made for a longer transit. Cold Lake was not quite next door, but near as damn it. So quite quick to get up and get set up, which helps. More fuel for operating, less fuel to use transiting to and from, etc., etc. And as I say, I know that we had tankers to get us there. Did the tankers stay with us? I can't recall whether we used air-to-air refueling. And my memory of it was such that the proximity of the operating areas probably meant we didn't need tanking.
Right.
So they went back to do something else. Yeah. And then we had the missions, etc., as I tried to execute as brief, and it was formed a very, very similar story to most multi-element missions. There'd be several objectives for elements to try and achieve, and it'd be the principle of the strikers to get to the target. We would have to deal with a red air of a certain level, and of course at the start of the exercise they kept the levels down and then slowly ramped them up in terms of complexity. Commensurate with our ability to pick up the game and pick up the pace, so that towards the end they really were quite complex and quite aggressive. And I'll just refer back quickly, and I'm sure some of your audience have heard my views on this before, but the aggressors from Nellis were the experts for Red Air, and Red Air was something. And I cannot speak for the Royal Air Force now, but certainly up until when I left in the mid-2000s, 2010, 2011, we hadn't really grasped the concept of red air, and a lot of people didn't understand it. A lot of people thought red air was very simple. Just get up there, fly around in circles, get shot, go home. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. Red air is probably more complex to do it properly than blue air. Red air are facilitators. Red air are teachers. Red air tries to maximise the learning points for blue air.
Yeah.
If blue air go up and completely spack up the mission and get no learning points out of it because of the buffoonery or whatever, then red air have failed. What Red Air do is they agree the level of aggressor that they're going to face, that Blue Air are going to face. And it's really down to Blue Air to say, this is what we need for our training needs. We need something simple on the first one, or we'd like to see this, that, or whatever. And it could be both the general level of competence that Red Air's displaying. How good is the radar? How good are their tactics? How good is their formation discipline? What weapons are they using? They're not deciding, well, we're going to pull something out of the bag here that's going to shock you. No, they say to Blue Air, what do you want to see today? And they will give it to them. Even down to, I remember one thing I do recall on a mission that I led was they set up a very nice, what they call a SAM trap, which is they have we know about it. There is a SAM site of a whatever system we're simulating, so we know its doctrinal range of, that they'll fire at and they will engage in. So we have a missile engagement zone, and they have fighters out front who try and lure us towards the SAM site. And at the last minute, they will disappear, and suddenly we find ourselves, because we haven't been paying attention, in the middle of the maze, and lo and behold, a SAM X, 6, 10, whatever it is, has simulated shot us down, shooting an aircraft down. So that's called a SAM trap. And Red Air set one up for us, and it was a good little exercise within the bigger mission. But that's what Red Air do. But the real skill comes from during the mission. Red Air leader, inevitably call sign MiG-1, has to assess how the mission is developing. And if he can see that Blue Air are tripping up for whatever reason, he has to have, and he does have the ability to say to his formation, okay, we are level 3 MiGs today. It's not working. Let's take it back to level 2. So they actually turn the difficulty level of the game down so that Blue Air can now start to step forward again and get something out of it. When it comes to the debrief, they can talk about it, why it happened, but it's an expensive exercise to let it fall flat on its face while it's happening. And that's what Red Air will attempt to prevent happening by backing off if they see Blue Air tripping up. If Blue Air are coping, what they don't do is crank it up unless it's been pre-agreed. They will go up to the level that Blue Air wanted and deliver that. And Blue Air will take the learning points that they want. That's how Red Air should work. The Royal Air Force never had that concept during the 80s, 90s and early 2000s. It was often, and I saw it on the F3 force, individuals taking Red Air on as a challenge. I can beat you with one hand tied behind my back because I've got a lesser weapon. And if you do beat me, it's only because I've got a lesser weapon. There was egos getting in the way, and they just failed to see the concept. Well, that's all. Anyway, off my hobby horse. That's Red Air. And Red Air from Nellis are the experts, and they were really good. So we go up and we do the mission, and they would have perhaps a couple of setups. So if you were kill removed, and that would be called by the range, who would be able to identify, the range controller could identify via the pod that you're carrying, not necessarily your call sign, that you had to remove yourself. And again, this would have been briefed beforehand, how long you are out the game for, and you go into a reset area away to one side, a bit like an actor just leaving the stage and standing in the wings still, or the yellow card, more like, in a football, a rugby match. You know, you're in the sin bin for 10 minutes, then you're back out again as regen, as a new player. Slightly artificial, but it means the crew that are being kill removed don't miss out on the training value of being airborne, and they get something else out of it. So there's a balance between realism and trying to maximise the training value for everybody. If you get shot in the first 2 minutes and then that's it, it's a kind of wasted mission for you. So that's what they're driving at. And then, of course, then at the end of it all, probably more difficult than the departure is the recovery. For a formation leader who's been working quite hard, pulling all your guys together, usually maybe just a 4-ship or something, get them in order, get them heading home. What's the fuel levels? Inevitably, 1 or 2 will be short of fuel, but guess what? The 3 or 4 other formations around you will not be flush for fuel as well. So it could be quite tricky getting back into the airfield. Fortunately, Cold Lake, not too complex in terms of air traffic, airspace around it, so it wasn't as convoluted as I keep going back to Nellis, where you're pretty much jumping through a whole series of hoops of positions and heights and sequencing, etc., to get back in. Cold Lake was a lot easier. Down on the ground, and then again, the temptation is to get out of the aircraft and go, great, right, where's the coffee? Nope, time. Time is against us again, because already we will have certain debrief times that we must meet. The first thing that we'll do is straight to having signed the jets back over to the engineers, straight back into our own little ops accommodation where we start to look at the mission tapes. And navigators will know the times, and between us we will work out particularly trigger presses and results, i.e. weapons flying and did we get kills. And if we are claiming kills, we would then go to a computer program that we had, particularly for the AMRAAM, where we would work out, looking at target evasion versus time of flight, positions, etc., whether in fact it came up with a valid kill or not. And we needed to have that information for the debrief, to look at the replay of the mission in the big amphitheatre. We get all that information squared away. We have a quick domestic debrief. Was there any dangerous things? Was there any safety issues? Anything that the big picture formation needs to know about how we did business. They weren't worried about whether somebody missed a call sign or somebody was out of position, unless it was a major factor. Then usually get to the time of the mission replay. We're in the amphitheatre, and again, this needed to be marshalled quite carefully by the blue mission leader, particularly if he was an air defender, because this could get quite extended. And behind or beyond the replay in the mission replay would be a mass debrief for everybody involved. And we didn't want that at fast asleep at the other end of the day because people needed food and what have you. So it's very easy to expand. So again, the word was efficiency and control. But we'd go in, generally speaking, we'd have a look at the flow, and it would be on a big screen in front of us. We see all the pods representing the aircraft moving relative to each other. We'd run through it about 5 times speed, just so you got a general idea of, so they went that way, we went that way, that came up, they went right, okay, got it. Yep, that's my mind. We'd then go forward at normal time, and at that point, individual crews or pilots could stand up and shout for the display to be stopped because they had a point. And it would generally, hopefully, be an important safety point or a fundamental tactical point, or usually a trigger press and a result. So they would say, 3, 2, 1, stop. Right. Pod number 251 is trigger pressing against pod number such and such. It's an AIM-120, an AMRAAM shot. And they would go, okay, thank you. We'll continue. Call me stop at your timeout. So they would then continue, because generally speaking, it would be another trigger press, and you have to keep track of everybody. So individually, you're watching it, and then you go 3, 2, 1, stop. Right, pod 251 is now timing out missile against pod such and such, and the result is kill. So that unless there was some sort of they go, okay, take out pod such and such, and they would black it out, grey it out for the rest of that time period, so you could now see. So that meant if pod 253, who had just been blacked out, had any subsequent trigger presses during his yellow card period, shall we say, they don't count. Yeah. Because for real, he wouldn't have been there. So you go, my shot's not going to count, so I'll tell you what, I'll just sit here and be quiet until you're regenerated, and then you go on. And they would quite quickly, and it was quite a skill between the mission leader and the exercise director to keep track of that, because there would be somebody on a keyboard just waiting for the call saying, right, pod 253 is now regenerated, bring them back, bang, and you come back into life, etc. Even just explaining it, you can see it's going to take quite a time. It could take quite a long time, particularly if there was a complex engagement and or arguments. No, I did that wasn't right. I wasn't target. I didn't, and you would have to try, you rely on the mission leader and the exercise director sort of keeping a lid on it and keeping it in control. Otherwise, it could ramble on forever. And usually there was an agreement to say, we'll have a chat afterwards outside, offline. And that's how it was resolved. So they went through the whole thing. We summarised. The exercise director is keeping a kill log. So he's seeing the number of shots, blue kills. What's also, I should have mentioned, is red air are in there as well, obviously. So they're putting in their trigger presses and talking about kills, etc., etc. Also, if there were any SAM kills, if that was in the scenario. And then they would sort of summarise and say, right, I've got it all. There would be a mass now. There would now be a mass debrief for all players, because the mud movers, strikers, wouldn't necessarily be in there unless they had some air-to-air kills. We wouldn't be really interested at this point in terms of what their ground results were. They're doing that in a separate debrief. Yeah. Then it would all come together, and it would be big picture stuff in terms of safety. Did the plan work? Would you do it a little bit different? What were the results? And that mass debrief generally didn't go on too long. And then that was it. And so generally speaking, that was pretty much the whole day for the players that were involved in that. There I'm just trying to remember whether, in fact, there were two missions. There might have been a morning mission and an afternoon mission, possible. But the two, there would be two separate teams. You couldn't really get involved in two missions a day of that complexity, and you wouldn't for in ops. And then after that, it was off for some Molson ice and pizza and what have you, etc., etc. But that's really the scope of the missions themselves. Very similar to Red Flag, and of course the whole point is that they're kind of following what you would do for real on operations. Although in operations they can afford to expand the timeline into the previous day for the prep briefs, etc., etc. So that's kind of how it went.
Yeah, and I want to ask, like, how did the F3 fare in that exercise? 2004. Was it still a relevant aircraft? Was it still a threat in the air-to-air? Yeah.
Yes, it was. As I say, I doubt we had JTIDs, which was a little bit of a degradation for us. But the radar was up to its standard. The ASRAM was excellent, and the AMRAM, within the limited parameters we could use it safely, the rules of engagement, was a step forward from the Skyflash. Our RHWR, as ever, right from the start, was excellent. So, yes, at range, as ever, we could do all right. We were flying, I think we were flying with the 1,500 litre tanks on, which probably means we didn't need the air-to-air refueling. So that kept us subsonic, but we're over land anyway. G limits a little bit down because we've got the tanks on, but otherwise we could do all right as long as we kept the enemy at arm's length. If I could see a MiG-6, an F-16 MiG aggressor, if I could visually see him, I knew I was in trouble. Because we just keep us alive. But something's gone wrong because that's not the place we would intend to be. So something's gone wrong for us to be there. But so to answer your question, we came out all right, actually. What was interesting was the Phantom F4Fs, because they had AMRAM and they had the upgraded radar. I can't remember the details of it, but they were the latter stage or latter marks or a version of the Luftwaffe F4Fs. J79 engines, very smoky. God, you can see them miles away, black lines when they opened the throttles. And that was a problem for them. The Americans, or the F-15s, I've said this before, the American F-15s would come in at high block 40,000 feet plus, could well be contrailing. Do you know what? They didn't care that people could see them because their attitude was, we're coming. What are you going to do about it? Because they had full mid-course guidance on their AMRAMs, so their launch ranges were much further out because of that. Their launch ranges were much further out because of their height and speed. They were giving the energy they were giving to the missile at the start, so they didn't care that people could see that. In fact, they used it almost like an intimidation factor. We were still at the stage of, we don't want to be contrailing. We don't want anybody to see us. We're still the sneaking about, skullduggery and tricks at that level because our AMRAM wasn't quite long enough. But I recall the Germans tended to be, let's charge straight through. They didn't want to turn much. But they were reasonably effective with their AMRAMs, but not as effective as the Americans were at that time.
Mm-hmm. And I always wonder, just on the social level, like coming out of the flight, like obviously I'm guessing you all mixed together and stuff like that. What was the banter like? Are you talking to the aggressor F-16s? Was there much banter between aircraft? Like, oh, what are you going to do with that? Outside the professional level, like I'm talking about the social level.
I think actually it wasn't banter. We weren't actually knocking each other. You find that what happens is people are quite respectful. They're more interested in finding out how the aircraft works. I don't mean in a technical intelligence side, but generally, what's it like? How do you operate? So it was quite friendly and quite interesting in terms of talking to all the different elements. The Red Air guys, that's when I learned a lot about Red Air. I had visited them at Nellis as well, But that was quite interesting. And they tended to be a little bit more reserved. They weren't really asking because they knew a lot anyway. But for instance, talking to the Germans, talking to the mud movers, etc., was quite interesting. There is a funny story. In fact, it was one of those moments where you go, "Oh my God, should we do this?" It was a mission. My navigator was going to be the Blue Air leader, and there had developed a little thing in the brief where somebody tells a joke at the start.
Right.
And of course, multinational, that can be a little bit fraught in terms of people understanding what the joke is and what have you. Anyway, I don't know if you can recall, there was a series of adverts for Carling Black Label, which were done in a funny World War II type manner. It might have been Alexander Armstrong and Ben Miller doing
yes. Yes.
I bet he drinks Carling Black Label, that sort of thing. Anyway, there was one where they did it based on the dam busters, and there is a German sentry walking along the dam as the Lancaster comes in and drops the bomb. But as the bouncing bomb goes down, the sentry looks, drops his rifle, and becomes a goalkeeper. And then there's a series of bouncing bombs, and the sentry's deflecting them like the German goalkeeper. He goes, "That'll be funny. I'll play that." And back in the crew room, I'm going, "Yeah, that'll be funny." But the Germans are there. Do you think the Germans will find it funny? Yeah, should we? Oh, I'm not sure. And we're right. And eventually, my nav decided, "No, I'm going to do it." So right at the start, he puts this video play on, and the moment it starts, I went, "Oh, John, no, Christ, we should have done this. We should have done this. Oh my God!" And the exercise director's face just went, "I don't believe the Brits are doing this."
Oh no!
And the Germans are down the front row, and they're looking. And I thought, "That's it. We're getting sent home now." And the moment it started to be obvious that it was comedy, and the sentry is doing his goalkeeper bit, the Germans were in fits. They thought it was brilliant, and then everybody else went, "Oh, yeah. Thank goodness for that." That was one of those moments where, "Oh, no, that's the end of my career. This is going to hold on. Why did you allow him to do that?" But we got away with it. But it's one of those things when you get different nations together. We do have different kind of senses of humour, but equally, it's a great mixture. Always together all the time. But it's it was good fun. It was good fun. And I think we were there. Well, the exercise was 2 weeks, which is typical of the duration. So there's a weekend break in the middle to give you a chance to go out and have a look around the area, etc., etc.
Brilliant stuff. I mean, a great explanation of Maple Flag there. But was it really beneficial for the RAF? And would that be is it every year, or is it every 2-3 years that the exercise Maple Flag is on?
I'm not sure how the programs worked. First off, very beneficial. Yeah, everybody enjoyed it. You're going to Canada for 2 weeks, but it's that exposure to the big mission, multi-element type scenario. As I've said right at the start, guys working up towards a 4-ship leader, towards an 8-ship leader, etc., valuable in terms of improving their qualifications and getting you ready for what we would face, as we discovered, and as some of us had discovered already in the Gulf Wars. Very. Invites, generally an RAF Air Defence Squadron would be invited to any of the exercises. So you've got Red Flag, Maple Flag, and Cope Thunder was the one that the Americans hosted up in Alaska, which again was a slight step down in size from Red Flag, Maple Flag, Cope Thunder, but a very different environment. But we would generally get invites to that, as would the strike squadrons, so GRs, maybe Jaggers, Harriers in those days. And then within the Air Force, it would be given on rotation so that there was a fair spread for each of the Tornado squadrons. So to answer your question, how often did it come round? Once every year and a half, I would say on average, we could expect to either go to a Maple Flag or a Red Flag, or perhaps a Cope Thunder in Alaska. so that was the sort of frequency it came. The red flags were happening. There were several red flags in a year. I'm not sure. I think there were several maple flags in a year, but the RAF weren't always invited or couldn't accept an invite to every one of them, because of course it's quite expensive in terms of logistics.
Of course, yeah.
To get the squadrons over there and all the necessary support. So generally speaking, each squadron could expect a North American day. Once a year would be pretty good, certainly once every 2 years as a minimum, other thing permitting.
Yeah, not bad. It does sound like a lot of fun, right? But it's been a while since we spoke. But yeah, what are you currently up to? Anything in the works, or just living the dream at the moment?
Well, continue volunteer working on the Mid Norfolk Railway as a signaller. In fact, I've been promoted. I am the deputy signalling inspector for the railway now, which means
Congrats.
I'm one of the two guys that checks out, validates the other signallers in terms of their qualifications and their currencies, etc., and also training. We've got 3 guys who are going through training to be signallers. One of them, would you believe, is a High Court judge.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, and sometimes he's not available because he's at the Old Bailey. So that's quite interesting. Obviously, we don't discuss specific cases, etc., but the general principle of how Crown Court, High Court judges work, etc., etc. It's quite. He just sees that as a great escape to come to the signal box and work on the Heritage Railway. So it's quite good. We have quite a variety of people involved on that. Of course, the other thing I do is my photography. I'm still very keen photographer. Strangely enough, not aviation-wise, because I tend not to take photographs that the main aviation photographers take, which are the kind you see in the aviation magazines, etc. Mine tend to be, as my wife would describe, a bit arty-farty. There's a lot of shadow and a lot of obscure views, etc., etc. Not the kind that enthusiasts would be interested in seeing, like proper colour schemes, good detail, what's that aircraft carrying, etc. I tend to be a little bit more off towards the wings. That said, I've never mentioned it before, but I do have a website where I've got all my pictures up, and there is a gallery that is that has got the aviation pictures in it, but most of it is landscape from around the place. RoyMacintyreimages.co.uk.
Brilliant stuff, and that'll be linked in the description. But as always, Roy, it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you for sharing a bit about your time at Maple Flag. It was really fascinating and great detail there. So yeah, cheers.
Always glad to come and talk to you, your audience, because I know that they are interested in that sort of stuff. So yeah, anytime. Thanks.